"You don't belong here," the officer said, loud enough for everyone on the courthouse steps to hear, as his hand closed firmly around her wrist and guided her down the wide stone stairs like she was nothing more than an interruption in the day's schedule, not a person with purpose. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain on concrete, and a low murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered near the entrance, some waiting for hearings, others simply passing by, all of them pausing just long enough to watch without stepping in. Ava Johnson didn't resist, not because she agreed, but because she understood something deeper than the moment unfolding around her, something steady that didn't shake even as her heels scraped lightly against the steps and the folder in her other hand pressed tight against her side. The courthouse behind her stood tall and silent, its glass doors reflecting fragments of sky and movement, a place built to represent order, yet right here on its front steps, judgment was happening without a single word of law being spoken. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his grip slightly, not rough, but unmistakably controlling, the kind of gesture practiced over years of believing authority meant final say. His posture straight, his voice firm, his presence enough to make most people step aside without question. "Ma'am, you were told to leave," he added, his tone clipped, as if repeating it made it more true, while a few bystanders exchanged glances, one man shifting his weight, another lowering his eyes, the quiet discomfort settling like a thin layer of dust over the scene. Ava's gaze lifted, not toward the officer, but toward the courthouse doors, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the situation, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed despite the tension threading through the air. Her coat moved slightly with the breeze, the fabric soft but worn, the kind of clothing that made people decide who you were before you ever spoke, and somewhere in the background, the distant hum of traffic blended with the faint echo of footsteps from inside the building. Life continuing just out of sync with what was happening on those steps. A woman near the railing whispered something under her breath, barely audible. Just a clerk. And no one corrected her, not because they knew, but because they didn't think it mattered. Ava heard it, or maybe she felt it, but her expression didn't change, her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of the folder, the papers inside shifting with a soft rustle that went unnoticed by everyone except her. The officer guided her down another step, then another, each movement deliberate, each second stretching just enough to make the moment linger, and still, Ava didn't look at him, didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply walked, steady and composed, as if the scene unfolding around her was only a small part of something much larger already in motion. The courthouse doors behind them opened briefly, a flicker of movement, then closed again, and for a split second, something shifted in the air, subtle, almost invisible, like the pause before a storm changes direction, but no one on those steps recognized it yet. No one except the woman being led away, who already knew exactly where this was going. Her shoes touched the final step, but she did not slow down, did not look back, and did not try to explain herself to anyone who had already decided who she was the moment they saw her. Ava Johnson had spent most of her life in rooms where her voice was an afterthought, where her presence was tolerated but never expected to matter, and somewhere along the way she had learned the discipline of silence, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly when to speak, and when to let the moment reveal itself. The folder in her hand was light, worn at the edges, the corners softened from being carried too often and opened too many times, and inside it were documents printed on standard letter paper, black ink on white pages. Nothing about them visually impressive, nothing that would catch the eye of someone passing by on courthouse steps. Yet to her, every page held weight, every line a purpose that did not need to be announced out loud. Officer Brooks released her wrist once they reached the bottom, his hand dropping to his side as if the task was complete, as if removing her from those steps had resolved whatever issue he believed she represented, and he gave a small nod to himself, a subtle confirmation of control restored, while behind him the courthouse doors opened again, letting out a brief wave of conditioned air that carried the faint scent of polished wood and paper, the kind of smell that belonged to rooms where decisions were made and recorded. Ava adjusted her grip on the folder, smoothing the front with her palm, her movements unhurried, almost careful, as though time itself had slowed around her, and for a brief second her reflection caught in the glass of a parked car nearby. A simple image of a woman in modest clothes. Nothing about her signaling authority, nothing about her suggesting she had any claim to the building she had just been removed from. A man standing near the steps checked his watch, uninterested now that the moment had passed, while another person shook their head lightly and walked away, the small crowd dissolving as quickly as it had formed, because scenes like this, brief and unresolved, rarely held attention for long. Ava exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of clarity, her gaze lifting once more toward the courthouse doors, and this time there was something different in her eyes, not defiance, not anger, but certainty, the kind that does not need validation from anyone else to exist. She turned slightly, aligning herself with the entrance again, her posture straightening just enough to shift the way the light caught her face. And though no one around her noticed, something about her presence had changed, subtle but undeniable, like a quiet recalibration of the space itself. Inside the folder, one page shifted just enough to reveal a faint embossed seal pressed into the paper, the outline barely visible unless you were looking for it. And as Ava took her first step back toward the courthouse, the same door she had just been guided away from, the world around her continued, as if nothing significant was about to happen, as if the next few moments would be no different from any other morning. And that was exactly what made it matter. The glass doors opened before she could reach for them. A suited man stepping out mid-conversation with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent, and he stopped just short of brushing past her, his eyes flicking over her for half a second before moving on, already dismissing her as part of the background, someone who existed around the courthouse but not within it. Ava did not pause, her hand steady, as she pulled the door the rest of the way, stepping inside where the temperature dropped slightly, and the air carried that quiet, controlled stillness unique to places where every word could carry consequence. The lobby stretched wide in polished stone and muted tones, security desks positioned like checkpoints of order, and people moved with purpose, lawyers with briefcases, clerks with stacks of files, each one fitting into a system that rarely noticed those who did not immediately signal importance. Ava walked forward at an even pace, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to hesitate, her heels clicking softly against the floor, a sound that blended into the rhythm of the building. And for a moment it felt as if nothing had happened outside at all, as if she had never been escorted down those steps just minutes earlier. Behind her, the doors closed with a low, final sound, and across the room, Officer Brooks had re-entered through a side corridor, his presence cutting through the space again, scanning briefly, his gaze landing on her with a flash of recognition that sharpened his posture. He frowned slightly, not expecting to see her back inside, not expecting the situation to continue, and he began walking toward her with measured steps, each one carrying the quiet authority of someone who believed repetition would enforce compliance. Ava saw him before he spoke, but she did not change direction, her eyes moving past him instead, toward the hallway that led deeper into the courthouse, where courtrooms lined the corridor and doors opened and closed with soft, controlled precision. A clerk hurried by with a stack of documents, nearly brushing Ava's shoulder, then stopping abruptly as one sheet slipped loose and fell to the floor, the sound faint but distinct, and Ava bent slightly, picking it up without hesitation, her fingers aligning the page carefully before handing it back, her touch precise, practiced, and the clerk nodded quickly, distracted, already moving on without a second glance. Officer Brooks closed the distance, his voice low but firm as he reached her side. "Ma'am, I told you to leave," he said, not raising his voice this time, but carrying an edge that suggested the conversation should have already ended, and a few nearby heads turned again, not fully engaged, but aware enough to sense tension. Ava turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not invite argument, and for a brief second, there was something in her eyes that did not match the role he had assigned to her, something measured, almost assessing, as if she were not reacting to him, but noting him. She shifted the folder slightly in her hand, the top page sliding just enough to reveal a line of text beneath the seal, bold and centered, words that most people would overlook unless they were expecting to see them, and then she spoke, her voice even, clear, not loud, but carrying just enough to settle into the space between them. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, and before he could respond, before the moment could escalate into something louder or more visible, she turned forward again and continued walking toward the courtroom hallway, leaving behind a pause that lingered longer than it should have, the kind of pause that made people look twice, even if they did not yet understand why. The hallway narrowed as she moved deeper into the building, the sounds of the lobby fading into a softer, more controlled quiet where every footstep seemed to carry intention, and the doors along the corridor stood closed like boundaries between moments, each one holding a different story behind it. Ava's pace did not change, her posture steady, her gaze fixed ahead, but there was a precision to her movement now, as if each step had already been decided long before she took it, and behind her, Officer Brooks followed, not rushing, but not letting the distance grow either, his presence a steady pressure in the space, the kind that expected compliance without needing to demand it out loud. A pair of attorneys stood near one of the courtroom doors, speaking in low tones, their conversation slowing as Ava approached, their eyes shifting briefly toward her and then toward Brooks behind her, reading the situation without fully understanding it, and choosing, like most people in that building, not to get involved. "Ma'am," Brooks said again, his voice firmer now, controlled but carrying an unmistakable insistence. "This area is restricted if you do not have business here." And his words echoed slightly against the polished walls, drawing a few more glances, small interruptions in the rhythm of the hallway. Ava stopped, not abruptly, but with a calm finality that made the moment settle, and she turned just enough to face him, her expression composed, her eyes steady, not confrontational, not defensive, simply certain, and for a second, the distance between them felt different, not measured in steps, but in understanding. She adjusted the folder in her hand again, her thumb sliding along the edge until the top page shifted forward just slightly, enough for the header to catch the overhead light, the embossed seal becoming clearer, the text beneath it aligning into something recognizable, something official, though still not fully revealed. Brooks glanced down for a fraction of a second, his focus instinctively drawn to the document. But the moment passed quickly, his attention returning to her face, his certainty still intact, built on what he believed he already knew. "I am going to need you to leave the building," he continued, his tone measured, procedural, as if repeating the instruction would close the situation, and a nearby clerk paused mid-step, sensing the tension, watching just long enough to understand that something was unfolding that did not quite fit the usual pattern. Ava held his gaze, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried in a way that made the surrounding space listen. "You are interrupting a proceeding that has already begun," she said, and the words did not sound like a defense, they sounded like a statement of fact, something already in motion, something not dependent on his approval. A faint sound came from farther down the hallway, the creak of a courtroom door opening, followed by the soft shuffle of movement inside, and a voice, distant but clear enough to reach them, called out, "All rise." The familiar phrase echoing just enough to shift the air in the corridor, and for a brief second, Brooks hesitated, not fully, but just enough for uncertainty to flicker beneath the surface of his authority. Ava turned before he could respond, her movement smooth, deliberate, and began walking again toward the open courtroom door, the light from inside spilling into the hallway in a soft, steady glow, and though nothing had been explained, nothing had been announced, the moment had begun to change shape, the quiet certainty she carried now impossible to ignore, even if it was not yet understood. The words, "All rise," lingered in the air like a quiet command that reshaped everything around it. And inside the courtroom, chairs shifted softly against the floor as people stood, their attention moving toward the bench with practiced instinct, while just outside the doorway, Ava stepped into the light without hesitation, her figure outlined briefly against the darker hallway behind her. The room itself carried a different kind of silence, heavier, more deliberate, the kind that settled over every person present when something important was about to unfold, and rows of wooden benches held. Attorneys, observers, and clerks, each one turning slightly, their focus narrowing as they tried to place her, to understand why she was entering from the back instead of the side, why she moved with such quiet certainty despite the moment that had just passed outside. Officer Brooks reached the doorway a second later, stopping just short of crossing the threshold, his posture tightening as he took in the scene, the standing room. The expectation, the shift in tone that no longer matched the assumption he had carried down the hallway. Ava continued forward, her steps measured, the soft sound of her heels echoing once, then fading into the stillness. And as she approached the front of the room, a clerk near the bench glanced up, then froze, recognition flickering across their face in a way that did not match surprise, but confirmation, as if something anticipated had finally aligned. The folder in Ava's hand lowered slightly as she reached the steps leading up to the bench, her fingers releasing it just enough to rest it against the polished wood surface. And for a brief second, everything slowed, the subtle movements in the room pausing as if waiting for something unspoken to resolve. Brooks took a step forward, his voice low but urgent now. "Ma'am, you cannot be in here," he said, though the words lacked the certainty they had held moments before, and a few heads turned toward him, not with agreement, but with confusion, as if his presence and that tone no longer fit the room he had entered. Ava did not respond immediately, her attention shifting instead to the space in front of her, the bench, the chair behind it, the small, simple object resting there, untouched, waiting, and the light from the tall windows along the side of the courtroom fell across the surface, catching the edge of polished wood that had marked authority in that room for years. One of the attorneys near the front adjusted their stance, their expression tightening as recognition began to spread, quiet but undeniable, moving from one person to another like a ripple that did not need words to carry it. Ava placed her hand on the edge of the bench, steady, deliberate, and for the first time since she had entered, she looked up fully, her gaze moving across the room, not searching, not uncertain, but acknowledging, as if she had always belonged in that exact position, behind her. Brooks stopped completely now, his presence no longer advancing, his certainty replaced by something slower, something unsettled, as the room itself seemed to realign around her. Ava reached forward, her fingers closing around the handle of the gavel resting on the bench, lifting it with a motion that was neither hurried nor dramatic, simply natural, as though it had always been hers to hold. And in that single, quiet action, the last of the room's uncertainty fell away, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost physical, every eye fixed, every assumption dissolving in the space between what had been believed and what now stood undeniable. The weight of the gavel in her hand was not heavy, but it carried something far greater than its size, something that settled into the room without a single word, and Ava held it for a brief moment without moving, without rushing to speak, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for everyone present to feel it, to recognize that what they were witnessing was not confusion, not interruption, but a correction. The light from the windows traced along the polished surface of the bench and across her fingers, steady and composed, and the faint hum of the building seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by a stillness so complete it made even the smallest movement noticeable, a chair shifting, a breath held a second too long, the quiet rustle of fabric as people adjusted their stance. Ava's gaze moved slowly across the room, not searching for approval, not reacting to the stares, but acknowledging the space as if it had always belonged to her, as if every person standing there had simply arrived late to understanding it. Behind her, Officer Brooks remained at the threshold, his hand hovering near his side, as though unsure what to do with it now, the certainty that had guided him just minutes earlier dissolving into something unfamiliar, something quieter, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not speak. A clerk near the front lowered their eyes, straightening a stack of documents that no longer needed adjusting, while one of the attorneys slowly exhaled, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift from assumption to realization, from control to recognition. Ava lowered the gavel slightly, not striking it, not yet, letting the moment breathe, letting the room settle into its new alignment. And in that pause, something deeper took hold, not authority imposed, but authority revealed. Her other hand rested lightly against the edge of the bench, fingers relaxed, her posture upright but unforced, the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to prove anything because the truth had already done the work for her. The courtroom itself seemed to respond. The air no longer tense but focused, the scattered uncertainty gathering into a single, shared awareness that the roles they had assumed were no longer valid, that the story they thought they understood had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Ava's eyes lifted slightly, meeting the room at eye level, not above, not below, but directly, and when she finally moved, it was simple, deliberate, the kind of motion that carried clarity without effort, her hand rising just enough to position the gavel above the sound block, holding it there for a fraction of a second longer than expected, a quiet invitation for the room to fully arrive in the moment. And in that suspended breath, before the sound that would mark the beginning, before any words were spoken, there was only stillness, complete and undeniable, the kind that does not ask for attention, but commands it anyway. The gavel came down with a single, clean sound that did not echo loudly but carried through the room with absolute clarity, a precise mark that separated everything that had happened before from everything that would follow, and Ava's voice rose just after it, steady and measured. "Court is now in session," she said, not loudly, but with a tone that left no space for doubt, no room for interruption. And the words settled into the room like something long overdue. The people who had remained standing did not move at first, as if their bodies needed a second to catch up with what their minds were only beginning to understand. And then, almost in unison, they began to sit, slowly, carefully, eyes still fixed on her, as though looking away might break whatever this moment had become. Officer Brooks stood at the doorway, unmoving, his posture rigid in a way that no longer signaled authority but hesitation, his gaze locked on the figure at the bench, the same woman he had escorted down the steps minutes earlier, now occupying a space he could not reconcile with what he thought he knew. Ava set the gavel down gently, not with emphasis, but with intention, her hand resting beside it for a moment before she reached for the folder she had carried, opening it with a quiet familiarity that spoke of preparation, not improvisation, and the top page revealed itself fully now, the seal clear, the text beneath unmistakable, formal language that did not belong to a clerk, did not belong to someone passing through, but to someone appointed, designated, recognized. A clerk near the bench leaned slightly forward, their voice low but audible enough to carry. "All parties present for the docket of the United States District Court, presiding Judge Ava Johnson." And the words moved through the room like a shift in gravity, subtle but undeniable, each person absorbing it in their own way, some with widened eyes, others with a quiet nod, as if pieces had finally aligned into something that made sense. Ava's expression did not change, not because the moment lacked significance, but because she had already arrived at it long before anyone else had, her gaze moving briefly toward the doorway where Brooks remained, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met, not in confrontation, not in accusation, but in recognition of what had been misunderstood. She looked away just as calmly, returning her attention to the room, to the case before her, to the role she carried without needing to declare it. One of the attorneys cleared their throat softly, adjusting their jacket, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a careful composure, while another reached for a pen, the familiar routines of the courtroom beginning to reassemble themselves around the new reality. Brooks shifted slightly, his hand lowering completely now, the last trace of his earlier certainty dissolving into silence. And though he did not step forward, he did not leave either, held in place by a moment that had turned in a way he had not anticipated. Ava turned a page in the folder, the soft sound of paper against paper grounding the room again, and when she spoke next, it was not to explain, not to justify, but to proceed, her voice steady, focused. "Let us begin," she said, and with those simple words, the final layer of doubt fell away, leaving only the quiet, undeniable truth of who she was and where she stood. The room moved forward, but something within it had already shifted beyond routine, beyond the usual rhythm of arguments and objections, and Ava allowed the proceedings to unfold with a calm precision that did not rush, did not linger, each word measured, each glance deliberate, her presence anchoring the space in a way that required no reinforcement. The attorneys presented their positions, their voices controlled, their language formal, yet beneath it there was a subtle adjustment, a carefulness that had not been there before, as if they were now aware that they were not just being heard, but understood at a level they had not anticipated. Ava listened without interruption, her eyes steady, occasionally making a note, her pen moving smoothly across the page, and every so often, she would look up, not to challenge, but to clarify, asking a question that cut through layers of assumption and brought the matter back to its core, her tone even, respectful, yet unmistakably firm. At the back of the room, Officer Brooks remained still, his presence no longer commanding, no longer central, but not invisible either, suspended in a quiet realization that had not yet found words, his gaze shifting once, briefly, toward the floor, then back up again, as if trying to understand how the moment had unfolded in a way he had not foreseen. A clerk approached the bench during a pause, placing an additional document beside Ava's folder, their movements careful, almost reverent, and Ava acknowledged it with a slight nod, her attention returning immediately to the matter at hand, the transition seamless, as if she had been presiding there for years. One of the attorneys hesitated mid-sentence, then adjusted their phrasing, choosing their words more carefully, their earlier confidence tempered by the clarity in her questions, and the courtroom responded in kind. The scattered uncertainty from before replaced by a focused attentiveness that held steady from one exchange to the next. Ava closed the folder briefly, resting her hand over it, and looked out across the room, her gaze passing over each person without judgment, without emphasis, simply seeing them. And in that moment, the authority she held did not feel imposed. It felt earned, not by title alone, but by the quiet consistency of how she carried it. Her eyes moved once more toward the doorway, where Brooks still stood, and though no words were exchanged, something passed in that glance. Not accusation, not triumph, but recognition, a silent acknowledgement of a moment that had been misunderstood and corrected without spectacle. She returned her focus to the case, her voice steady as she outlined the next steps, her words clear, structured, leaving no room for confusion, and as she spoke, the room followed, each person aligning with the direction she set, not because they were told to, but because it made sense, because it was right. The proceedings continued, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden turns, but with a quiet momentum that carried weight in its simplicity. And as the session moved toward its close, Ava reached once more for the gavel, her hand resting on it for a brief moment before lifting it slightly, the motion unhurried, deliberate, and when she brought it down, the sound marked not just the end of a session, but the completion of something far larger, something that had begun long before that morning and had now settled into place with clarity and purpose. The courtroom emptied slowly, not with the usual rush of footsteps and low conversations, but with a quieter, more measured departure, as if each person carried something with them that required a moment of thought before stepping back into the outside world. And Ava remained at the bench for a few seconds after the final movement, her hand resting lightly on the wood, her gaze lowered just enough to follow the fading motion of the room without fully engaging it. The light from the tall windows had shifted slightly, stretching longer across the floor now, catching the edges of the benches and the polished surface in front of her. And in that stillness, the space felt different, not because it had changed, but because it had revealed something that had always been there. She closed the folder in front of her with a soft, deliberate motion, aligning the pages carefully before setting it aside, her movements unhurried, her posture steady, the quiet rhythm of someone who did not need to rush toward the next moment because she was already where she was meant to be. Near the doorway, Officer Brooks had not moved far, his position now slightly to the side, no longer blocking the path, no longer directing anyone, just standing with a stillness that mirrored the room itself. And when Ava finally looked up, her eyes met his again, not sharply, not with accusation, but with a calm recognition that held no need for words. He shifted his weight slightly, his shoulders lowering just enough to release the tension he had carried earlier, and though he did not step forward, there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way he stood, a subtle understanding of something that had not been explained, but had become clear all the same. Ava gave the smallest nod, not formal, not ceremonial, but human, an acknowledgement of presence rather than position. And then she rose from the bench, her chair moving back with a soft sound that echoed briefly before fading into the silence. She stepped down from the platform with the same measured pace she had carried throughout. The distance between the bench and the floor marked not by height, but by the shift from role to movement, from authority to quiet continuity. As she walked toward the exit, the courtroom behind her settled completely, empty now except for the lingering sense of what had taken place. And the door opened smoothly as she reached it. The hallway beyond waiting with its steady rhythm of footsteps and distant voices. Brooks moved slightly to the side, creating space without being asked, his gaze following her for a moment before lowering, and Ava passed without pause, her steps even, her expression unchanged, the same calm presence that had carried her through every moment now guiding her forward. The hallway light caught her briefly as she moved away, reflecting softly against the polished floor, and the sounds of the courthouse resumed around her, familiar, continuous, unchanged on the surface, yet somehow quieter, as if the building itself had taken note. She did not look back, not because she needed to, but because there was nothing left behind that required it. And as she continued down the corridor, the space she left behind held a silence that did not feel empty, but complete, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed, not asking to be remembered, but impossible to forget.